Okay, so this is the second video in our Europe Divided series, and today we're looking at the Berlin Crisis, which was one of the first confrontations between the two superpowers after World War II. As you can see in the picture here, you can see the Russian bear strangling the city of Berlin, and you'll soon see why that's significant. And so why was Berlin so important at the end of World War II? Well, Berlin was the capital of Nazi Germany, but it was more than just a city. It was a symbol of everything that Nazi Germany stood for. At the end of World War II, as Germany was retreating and eventually capitulated, there was a race to recapture that territory in Europe and capture Berlin. And so that shows you a bit about the superpower rivalry between the Allies and the Soviet Union. Even before World War II had finished. Also, Berlin and Germany are relatively central in Europe, so it's also a strategic and important location to be in control of. And so one of the agreements that was talked about in the Big Three conferences that we've talked about in a previous video is how to actually govern Germany after it had been defeated. And so they came up with a system of dividing Germany into 4 occupied zones. So we had the British zone, the French zone, the American zone, and the Soviet zone. Well done, thank you. But as you can see, the capital city of Berlin is actually right in the middle of the Soviet-controlled zone of Germany, which is an issue. So what they did in Berlin is they actually divided the city of Berlin into 4 zones as well. So we've got, again, the Soviet zone in the east, the American zone, the British zone, and the French zone. And so why do you think the Soviet Union has the biggest sector of Berlin? And that's something I want you to think about, and we'll discuss this in class. And so if we zoom out, here's a version of what Germany looked like at the end of World War II. And you can see Berlin itself is almost like an island in the middle of the Soviet-controlled territory in Germany. And you've got a tiny little, capitalist Western section right in the middle of this sea of communism. And so the Berlin Crisis began in 1948, and so the 3 zones, the Western zone, so the French, the British, and the American actually joined together, and this section was nicknamed Trizonia. So Trizone, the 3 joined together to make one Western sector. And because of the Marshall Plan and the money that America were pumping into it, it became very prosperous and it was accelerating very quickly in terms of its development and its economy, whereas the communist section was actually stalling and stagnating. And so there was a lot of resentment that grew between the 2 halves of Berlin. And the more that the economy flourished in the western half, the more that Stalin became agitated. And so in June 1948, he decided to cut off all supplies to West Berlin and basically blockade it and surround it. So he cut off the roads and the railways and communication. And so he was basically trying to use this to starve Western Berlin into submission and to get his way, which was to take over the whole of Berlin. And it kind of made sense for Stalin to do that because he had this tiny little western island in the middle of his Soviet-controlled Germany, and he saw that as threatening. He wanted that complete sector to himself. And so it was almost like a staring contest. He wanted to see what the West would do if he blockaded Berlin. And so there's a few options on how the West could respond to Stalin's blockade. They could give in to Stalin's demand, and they could help the 2 million people that he was trying to starve. But obviously that would be a propaganda loss for the West, and they would lose face in backing down to Stalin. They could invade the Soviet zone and take back West Berlin by force, but that would obviously mean risking a military conflict, and so soon after World War II they were very reluctant to do that. Or the third option was to actually fly in over the top and drop in all the supplies that the West Berliners needed. And that's what they did. And so the Berlin airlift began, and they made the choice to actually fly in supplies and resources and drop them into West Berlin. And again, Stalin was reluctant to shoot down the planes, and he was very conscious of starting an armed conflict as well. And so for 11 months, that's what the Allies did. They actually flew the British planes, French planes, and US planes actually flew the supplies in, and there was almost 1,000 planes a day that were landing in West Berlin. And over the space of that 11 months, 275,000 planes, or one plane every 3 minutes was landing in Berlin. And so overall, in that 11 months, it cost them $100 million to keep flying in the supplies, and 79 personnel actually died in the operation. And so there's some different sources here that I'd like you to analyse, and I'd like you to read these and think about them and answer the question down below, and we'll discuss this in class. Was the airlift a success? And so in 1949, in May, Stalin called off the blockade, and there's lots of different ways of looking at the success of the Berlin blockade. I guess the Cold War had gotten worse because it cemented some of those conflicts and some of those clashes between the Soviets and the Americans. Soon after this, Germany was actually permanently split into two, the Eastern Zone and the Western Zone, which we'll talk about in a minute. The United States were ready to use nuclear weapons and to use force if they had to, and it basically made both superpowers very conscious of the fact that they both possessed nuclear weapons, and that was a very real possibility. And it was the first staring contest of the Cold War, and it was diffused in the end. But this is an example of brinksmanship, where Stalin and the West brought the situation right to the brink of armed conflict without it actually happening. And this is one of the things that underpins the Cold War. All of these tensions that are simmering beneath the surface and almost break out into war, but don't quite. And so after the blockade, the West saw this as proof of Stalin's intentions to take over Europe. And this was his first go at doing that, by trying to take over West Berlin. And so the United States set up NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949. And because the United States had put so much money through the Marshall Plan into Europe, they wanted to have a lot of say as to what was going on, especially in Western Europe. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is an organization, a defense treaty between the United States and Canada, and also the western half of Europe, to protect each other in case of a Soviet invasion. And a couple of years later, the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviet equivalent, was set up to do the same, which involved the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc nations. So as I said, there was a permanent divide that happened in Germany after the Berlin blockade. The Western Allies set up the Federal Republic of Germany, which became West Germany, and then the USSR set up East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, and Germany was permanently divided into East and West, and that's the way that it stayed for another 4 decades. And so the NATO agreement was pioneered by America to protect their interest in Western Europe, but it involved countries like America and Canada, and then the Western European countries. So we've got Denmark, France, Holland, Italy, Norway, Portugal, etc., and they joined together to make the NATO treaty. And on the other hand, we have the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, which is that buffer zone that Stalin created between himself and Western Europe. And so here you can see on the NATO side, you can see the American symbol of the eagle as the pioneers of the NATO agreement, and you can see the Soviet bear as a symbol on the Warsaw Pact side, as the Soviets were leaders of the Warsaw Pact. And so this is what it looks like in terms of the geography of Europe. You can see the Soviet and Eastern Bloc countries here joining together to make the Warsaw Pact, and you can see the the North Atlantic Treaty. So we'd have Canada and USA over here, and then the Western European nations coming together to make NATO. Now, interestingly, you can see a couple of neutral nations here. We've got Spain, and we've got Sweden, and we've got Finland, Switzerland, and Austria, and you've also got Yugoslavia, which is a communist nation, but it chose not to align with the Warsaw Pact. Interestingly, there was also what's called the non-alignment movement. So there were countries throughout the 1950s and 60s that made a commitment to not align in the bipolar world, so not aligned with the USA or the Soviet Union, and this was led by India. And so there were lots of countries that were conscious of not getting entangled in this growing war of tension and threats that was dominating the world.